A retired military K-9 vanished into the forest and moments later uncovered a grave no one knew existed. What he found rewrote decades of betrayal and sacrifice. Could a loyal dog's final mission solve a cold case the government buried? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. Elijah's boots pounded against the uneven trail, his flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness like a desperate lifeline. But every frantic call of Titan's name was swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Panic clawed at his throat as memories of soldiers lost in chaos flooded his mind. Titan wasn't just a dog. He was a brother forged in fire, a warrior who'd stood where bullets rained and never flinched. And now he was somewhere out there, alone in a forest that seemed suddenly alive with menace. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. And then, through the suffocating silence, Elijah heard it. A faint but urgent scratching just beyond a curtain of thorned brambles. Forcing his way through thorns tearing at his uniform, he stumbled into a small clearing where the earth was raw and freshly disturbed beneath the skeletal remains of a fallen cedar. Titan was there, his paws a blur of frantic motion, dirt flying, as he dug with the kind of singular focus Elijah had only ever seen in combat zones, where every second could mean the difference between life and death. Elijah dropped to his knees beside him, brushing his hands through the loosened soil until his fingers struck something cold and unyielding. He pulled back the dirt with trembling hands and revealed a rusted military dog tag. Its edges worn, but the inscription still barely visible beneath decades of corrosion. Titan let out a low, mournful whimper, his head bowing against Elijah's arm, eyes locked on that small piece of metal, like it held the weight of every fallen soldier he'd ever known. Elijah's heart pounded as he read the name aloud, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. Captain Gabriel Vance. The name hit him like a physical blow, a ghost from forgotten records and whispered rumors of a soldier who vanished without a trace over 30 years ago, a man branded a deserter, but whose body was never found. And now, here in the heart of Ravenwood, his final resting place seemed to lie beneath their feet. But how did Titan know? What unseen thread of loyalty and memory had led him here tonight? Before Elijah could process the impossible, Titan's head snapped toward the dense tree line. A low growl rumbling deep in his chest as if warning of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Elijah rose slowly, scanning the darkness with a soldier's precision, his grip tightening on the flashlight handle as unease coiled in his gut. The forest around them had fallen deathly silent, the usual chorus of night creatures conspicuously absent. And in that terrible stillness, Elijah knew this was no ordinary night, and what lay buried here wasn't just a relic of the past. It was the first thread of a long-forgotten conspiracy unraveling before his very eyes. And somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the reach of his light, something or someone was waiting. The air hung thick with the scent of turned earth and something older, something sour and metallic that clawed at Elijah's senses as the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. He turned the dog tag over in his dirt-smeared hands, the faint inscription catching the weak beam of his flashlight. Captain Gabriel Vance. That name wasn't just a relic. It was a ghost from his academy days, a legend spoken about in hushed tones during cold nights on base, a man who had disappeared without a trace, his loyalty questioned, his honor buried under official lies. But how? How had Titan, a dog who had never known this man, led them directly to this forgotten grave? Titan sat back on his haunches now, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Elijah with a silent urgency that seemed almost human, as if begging him to understand that this was no coincidence, no random act of curiosity. This was a mission, unfinished and burning through time itself. Elijah's fingers dug deeper into the damp soil, uncovering more than just the dog tag. A faded photograph emerged next, its edges brittle and stained by years beneath the earth. He held it up to the light, his heart stalling as he recognized the uniformed man standing tall and proud beside a Belgian Malinois. The same haunting loyalty reflected in that dog's eyes that he now saw in Titan's. The insignia on the dog's collar matched the faded patch still stitched onto Titan's old service harness, a symbol of a unit so classified its records were said to have been erased. And then a horrible realization dawned. This wasn't just a grave, it was a message, left behind by a man who had known his death was coming, but chose to spend his last breath ensuring the truth would someday claw its way back to the surface. The rustle of leaves snapped Elijah from his thoughts, his instincts flaring as he swung his light toward the sound. For a moment, just at the edge of the beam, a pair of eyes reflected the light before vanishing into the woods. His breath quickened, the reality setting in. Someone else knew about this place, and whoever they were, they had no intention of letting the past stay buried without a fight. Titan rose, his posture tense, his ears pinned back as a low growl vibrated through his chest. Elijah knew that growl. It wasn't fear, it was warning. They were no longer alone in these woods. And as the darkness seemed to close in tighter, the photograph in his hand felt heavier, the dog tag colder, and the air thicker with secrets that refused to stay silent any longer. Whatever had started here wasn't finished. And Titan, with his unwavering gaze and restless stance, was ready to lead Elijah deeper into a past written not in ink, but in sacrifice, betrayal, and blood. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as the brittle fingers of the skeletal hand seemed to reach toward the surface, locked in eternal grasp around the faded photograph that told a story no official report had ever dared to record. His fingers trembled as he carefully pulled the photo free, brushing the loose dirt away to reveal the smiling face of a young Captain Gabriel Vance, standing tall and proud in a field of knee-high grass, his arm resting across the shoulders of a powerful Belgian Malinois, its stance alert, its eyes burning with a loyalty that seemed to transcend the photograph itself. But it wasn't just the familiarity of that scene that unsettled Elijah. It was the insignia on the dog's collar, a triangular emblem with a lightning bolt slashing through its center. The same insignia still faintly visible on Titan's retired service harness. A mark belonging to a unit so covert, their existence had been nothing more than a whispered rumor among even the most seasoned soldiers. Titan stood motionless beside him, his body tense, his ears tilted forward as if he could still hear the echoes of a command given decades before. A silent call to duty that stirred something ancient and unbreakable within him. Elijah's mind spun with the impossible connections. How did Titan know this place, this man, this mission buried under layers of classified lies and forgotten betrayal? And then, just as the weight of those questions began to crush his thoughts, his fingers brushed against something else beneath the dirt. Fabric, rotted and brittle, but unmistakably a uniform sleeve. Carefully, reverently, he unearthed the skeletal remains of Captain Vance, his bones lying twisted as though he had fought his final moments against the very earth that consumed him. And there, pinned to what remained of his chest pocket, was a set of commendation ribbons dulled by time, but still carrying the silent weight of a man who had given everything for a cause the world would never recognize. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the trees, carrying with it a mournful howl that wasn't Titan's, but seemed to come from the forest itself. A chilling lament that raised the hairs along Elijah's neck. He turned to Titan, who had lowered his head to the ground in a gesture of respect only soldiers understood. His eyes locked on the broken remains of a man who had died with his secrets buried deep and his loyalty never broken. Elijah felt something shift inside him then, a solemn vow taking root as the gravity of what lay before him settled into his bones. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a reckoning long overdue. And as the forest grew darker around them, and the weight of history pressed in from every side, Elijah knew that he and Titan had just crossed a line from which there was no turning back. They were no longer walking a trail, They were following the final footsteps of a soldier whose last mission had yet to be completed. The grave beneath the cedar became more than a final resting place. It became a battleground between forgotten truths and long buried lies. While camera crews lit up the forest with harsh artificial light and reporters crafted sensational headlines that barely scratched the surface of what had truly been found, Titan remained a silent sentinel, his powerful form stretched alongside the disturbed earth, his eyes unwavering, his ears attuned to echoes only he seemed able to hear. Each night, as the sky bled into blackness and the crowds dispersed back to the warmth of their homes, Titan returned his pause, treading the same solemn path through the mist-laden woods, his head held low as if burdened by a duty that refused to die. And when the clock struck midnight, a sound more chilling than the cold wind sweeping through the trees would rise. A low, mournful howl, raw and heart-wrenching, cutting through the stillness like a sorrow centuries old. That howl wasn't just grief. It was a call to those who had fallen unseen, unheard, their stories swallowed by the relentless march of time. And then, as if the forest itself responded to Titan's mourning, the earth began to give up its deadened secrets. It started with a shallow depression near the roots of a neighboring oak, where a group of volunteers unearthed a rusted ammunition case, sealed tight against the elements. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, stained with time and faded crimson, were pages of a field journal belonging to Captain Vance. The words were shaky, penned in what must have been his final hours, but each line burned with urgency, cataloging names, dates, and a mission known only by its code name, Project Revenant. The journal spoke of soldiers betrayed by their own command, men and their canine partners labeled as liabilities, and marked for silent removal to preserve a conspiracy rooted deep within the highest ranks. As the journal passed through trembling hands, a collective shiver settled over the town. This was no ghost story. This was a ledger of sacrifice paid in blood. And yet, Titan's vigil didn't end with that discovery. Night after night, even as new evidence surfaced and investigators combed through the woods under heavy military oversight, he remained by that grave, his presence a living testament to the bonds forged in war and the debts that could not be forgotten. Parents kept their children close when the howls began, while old veterans stood at their porches with hats pressed to their chests, eyes glistening as if remembering fallen brothers whose names never made it onto official memorials. And still, through the swirling fog and the bitter night air, Titan stood alone against the weight of history, a lone guardian refusing to rest until every last secret was brought into the light. And deep within those haunted woods, something else waited, buried not just in soil, but in the shame of forgotten men, ready to rise when the time was right. Elijah's hands trembled as he peeled back the stiff, blood-soaked oilcloth, the scent of rusted iron and aged paper thick in his lungs. The ledger within was a relic of agony and defiance, its cover warped, its pages stuck together in places by the dried remnants of a final violent stand. Titan sat close, his eyes locked on the journal, as if he understood the weight of every word pressed into those fragile pages, his ears twitching at every creak of the binding as Elijah slowly turned to the first legible entry. The handwriting was jagged, each line etched with urgency and despair, the ink smeared in places where rain or tears had fallen. Captain Vance had chronicled every detail, each page a confession written under the looming shadow of death. He named names, high-ranking officers who orchestrated a covert operation codenamed Project Revenant, an unsanctioned campaign that blurred the line between patriotism and personal power, a mission meant to eliminate political obstacles under the guise of national security. But when soldiers like Vance learned the truth and refused to follow legal orders, they were branded traitors and quietly erased, their loyalty repaid with betrayal. Their lives ended in unmarked graves scattered across forgotten lands. And it wasn't just the men, They targeted their canine partners too. The dogs trained to sniff out hidden threats and secrets. Dogs like Titan and the one captured in the faded photograph beside Vance, Ajax. The journal revealed how these loyal animals became liabilities. Their training too precise, their instincts too dangerous to leave alive. Orders were given to terminate them, to silence their handlers and their dogs in a final, brutal purge. Elijah felt bile rise in his throat as he flipped through the final pages. Vance's words growing more erratic, the ink darker where blood had mixed with the pen strokes. The last entry was a scrawled confession written in a shaking hand. They're coming for me now. I won't run. I won't leave him behind. If you find this, tell them we didn't break. Tell them we stood together until the end. The entry ended abruptly, the ink trailing off the page as if the pen had been ripped from his grasp. Elijah's vision blurred, his mind reeling from the magnitude of the cover-up, the weight of the sacrifice buried beneath bureaucratic lies. Titan pressed his head against Elijah's shoulder, his body warm and steady against the cold truth unraveling before them. In that moment, Elijah knew this was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a promise to be kept. The ledger wasn't just a record, it was a final testimony, a blood-soaked demand for justice, echoing from the grave through every painful syllable. And as the sun began to rise over the haunted horizon, bathing the clearing in a pale, unforgiving light, Elijah tucked the ledger close to his chest and rose to his feet. Titan stood beside him, silent but resolute, his gaze fixed beyond the trees as if he knew the battle wasn't over, not yet. The final reckoning was coming, and together they would see it through. The descent into the ravine felt like a journey into the forgotten veins of the earth itself, the air growing colder and heavier with every cautious step, as if the very ground mourned the sins committed beneath its surface. Titan moved ahead of Elijah, his paws sure despite the jagged rocks and unstable ground, his nose working the air with laser focus, following a scent trail left behind decades ago, but somehow still lingering like the final exhale of a dying secret. The bunker entrance was barely visible, its steel door rusted and buried under a blanket of moss and time. But Titan found it with terrifying precision, his paw resting against the corroded metal like a soldier reporting for duty. Elijah pressed his shoulder against the door, forcing it open with a shriek of tortured hinges that echoed through the ravine like a scream trapped in stone. The air that rushed out was thick with the stale bitterness of old betrayals and unfinished endings. And as the beam of Elijah's flashlight swept across the cavernous interior, the nightmare hidden from history finally revealed itself. Dust-laden crates lined the wall, each stamped with a faded insignia, the same one worn by Titan's retired harness, a symbol the world had been told never existed. Elijah pried open the nearest crate, his heart pounding as files spilled out like the blood-soaked confessions of ghosts long silenced. Names, coordinates, operations executed under the darkest banners of secrecy. And then, tucked beneath a tattered American flag stained by something darker than time, found the final, most damning file, Ajax. The classified orders were blunt and cold, a single sentence scrawled across the top page, subject to be terminated, immediate execution upon handler's failure. His throat tightened as he read further, the clinical language detailing how Ajax's advanced scent training had made him a threat to operations far beyond the battlefield, his loyalty weaponized against his own survival. But then, at the bottom of the file, in faded ink and a shaky hand, a single word stood alone, missing. The question that had haunted every soldier who knew the unit's darkest secret remained unanswered, until Titan moved toward a locked chamber at the far end of the bunker, his body low, his tail stiff, a low, mournful whimper vibrating in his throat. Elijah followed, forcing the door open against decades of resistance, his flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. to reveal a sight that stole the air from his lungs. In the corner of the room, curled in a final, lonely vigil, lay the skeletal remains of a dog, its frame still bearing the shredded remains of a collar that read a single word: Ajax. Titan approached slowly, his massive frame sinking to the cold concrete floor beside the fallen hero, his head resting gently against the remnants of a brother lost to time but never forgotten. In that silent, sacred moment, surrounded by the weight of betrayal and the unwavering bond of loyalty, Elijah felt the full measure of what had been lost and what must now be brought to light. This wasn't the end. This was the moment the silent witnesses would finally be heard. Elijah knelt slowly, his knees pressing against the cold, unforgiving concrete as his trembling fingers reached out to brush the brittle remains of the collar, its leather cracked and frayed, the nameplate dulled but still legible beneath the years of dust and sorrow. Ajax. The name tasted bitter on his tongue, a word that should have echoed across parade grounds and battlefields in triumph, not linger in the shadows of a forgotten tomb. The air felt heavier with every breath, the weight of unspoken promises and final acts of defiance pressing against his chest as if the bunker itself mourned what had been lost within its walls. Titan stood unmoving, his body a statue carved from loyalty and grief, his deep brown eyes locked onto the remains of his fallen counterpart, as if paying respects to a warrior whose story had been denied a proper ending. And in that agonizing silence, Elijah understood the depth of this tragedy. Ajax had not been simply abandoned. He had been left here to die alone, his final days spent clawing at the locked door, fighting against an ending he neither deserved nor understood. Elijah could almost hear the echoes of those final moments, the frantic scrapes of claws against steel, the desperate panting of lungs fading into silence, the unbreakable spirit of a loyal heart, refusing to give up until the very last breath. His throat tightened as he reached deeper, fingers tracing the scattered remains of what must have been a makeshift bed, a tattered army jacket crumpled in the corner, the faded name patch still barely visible under layers of grime. Vance. Elijah pressed the jacket to his chest, his eyes stinging as the full weight of the captain's final sacrifice settled in his soul. Vance hadn't just died in the woods. He had come here to try and free Ajax, to stand by his side until the end. But something or someone had stopped him before he could. And this bunker, this tomb carved into the earth, had become the final battlefield where loyalty had fought against betrayal and, even in death, refused to be silenced. Titan moved then, his powerful frame lowering beside the scattered bones of Ajax, his head resting gently against what remained of his fallen brother as a low, mournful whine slipped from his throat, a sound so raw and filled with grief it seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Elijah felt the tears fall freely now, his fingers clenching into fists as a fire lit in his chest. Not just sorrow, but righteous fury. This couldn't remain hidden. These sacrifices couldn't stay buried beneath layers of classified lies and forgotten missions. Standing slowly, Elijah placed a firm hand on Titan's shoulder, his voice hoarse but resolute. "We finished this," he whispered. And in the stillness, it felt as though even the ghosts around them stood in silent agreement. Titan rose, his powerful body standing tall beside Elijah, his eyes no longer filled with just mourning, but with purpose. Together they turned toward the darkness of the corridor, ready to bring the hidden truths into the unforgiving light. The cameras rolled as the nation held its breath, the imposing figure of retired General Clayton Rourke stepping up to the podium beneath the crushing weight of decades-long silence. His once proud shoulders sagged under the invisible burden of sins committed in the name of duty. And as the harsh lights bore down on him, illuminating every line of his weathered face, his voice cracked through the oppressive quiet, a sound more confession than command. "I am here to tell you what should have been told 30 years ago," he began, his hands trembling as they gripped the podium like a man clinging to the last remnants of his own humanity. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now swam with regret as he spoke of Project Revenant, the covert operation designed under the guise of national security, but fueled by ambition and unchecked power. His voice faltered when he recounted the decision to classify loyal soldiers as liabilities, brave men and their canine partners, marked for silent erasure to protect secrets too dark for public light. The room held its collective breath as he spoke the name that had haunted the edges of every classified report: Captain Gabriel Vance. Rourke's voice dropped to a hollow whisper as he confessed how Vance had learned the truth, how he had refused the order to eliminate evidence of the operation, and instead chose to protect his own, standing his ground with Ajax by his side, even as the noose of betrayal tightened around them. With tears welling in his eyes, the general admitted that when Vance was offered a chance to save himself, he refused to leave his wounded canine behind, choosing to die in the dirt and darkness rather than abandon the only soul who had never betrayed him. The silence in the room was suffocating, every eye locked on the broken man unraveling at the podium, his confessions falling like hammer strikes against the fragile facade of the government's long protected lies. Outside, as the confessions streamed across every television and phone screen, people gathered in hushed circles, their faces pale under the glow of flickering screens, their hearts breaking not just for the fallen soldiers, but for the loyalty betrayed, the promises broken in the name of politics and power. And through it all, Titan stood at the edge of the crowd, his head high, his proud figure silhouetted against the rising sun, a living testament to every promise kept and every sacrifice honored. When the general's final words echoed through the air, "We buried our heroes in shadows, and now I beg for their forgiveness." A single mournful howl broke the heavy silence, Titan's voice rising like a battle cry across the field of mourners, a sound that shook the nation's conscience to its core. And in that moment, it wasn't the general's confession that brought the world to its knees. It was the raw, undeniable power of a bond, unbroken by time, betrayal, or death. The wind carried a solemn hush over Arlington's sacred grounds. Its flag snapped crisply against gray skies, the air thick with the weight of long delayed justice. Soldiers stood at rigid attention beside polished caskets draped in stars and stripes, their rifles gleaming under the somber light, while bugles cried out the sorrowful notes of taps, each haunting sound a lament for the souls who had lain forgotten beneath the weight of silence and scandal. The names of the fallen echoed through the procession, their letters etched into freshly unveiled granite walls, no longer hidden in the classified darkness, but immortalized beneath the proud gaze of stone-carved heroes. And at the heart of it all stood Titan, his regal form wrapped in the folds of the American flag, his stance proud and still, a living monument to the loyalty that had outlived betrayal. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if searching for someone beyond the limits of the mortal world, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of every soldier who had ever knelt in sorrow and stood again in defiance. Crowds gathered in silent reverence as the medal of courage was fastened to Titan's service harness, a gleaming symbol of his unbreakable spirit and the final reckoning he had helped bring to light. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of a hero forged not in words or medals, but in acts of pure, unwavering devotion. But through all the fanfare and accolades, none of it seemed to matter to Titan. When the last rifle salute faded and the crowds dispersed, he turned away from the marble halls and the grand ceremonies, his paws carrying him back along the lonely trail to the weathered cedar grave in the heart of Ravenwood Forest. There, beneath the ancient boughs that had witnessed betrayal and redemption alike, Titan resumed his silent vigil, his body curled against the earth as the night fell like a shroud over the forgotten resting place. His eyes never closed, His ears never rested, as if waiting for a shadow to emerge from the darkness. For a loyal brother, lost to time to step through the veil and return home. And with every breath of the cool night air, every low sigh that stirred the fallen leaves, Titan remained the final guardian of a promise made in blood and sacrifice. A sentinel who understood that some wounds never heal, and some debts can only be paid through a lifetime of remembrance. Even as the nation healed and moved forward, Titan remained behind, holding his place against the turning world, a living reminder that true loyalty does not fade with time. It stands eternal, unwavering, until the very last light dims and the final call is answered. The dawn broke gently over Ravenwood Forest, the horizon painted in soft strokes of gold and pale crimson, as a fragile mist curled low around the ancient trees, draping the landscape in a reverent hush. The world seemed to hold its breath in that fragile moment, and beneath the weathered cedar, where earth and sacrifice had become one, Titan lay still. His powerful frame stretched across the grave that he had guarded through storms and seasons, his head resting against the earth, as if finally reunited with the soul he had waited for through countless sleepless nights. His eyes, once sharp and alert, were now peacefully closed, his breath no longer rising against the cold morning air. In that silent farewell, his body seemed more monument than mortal, a sculpture of loyalty carved by time and devotion. The forest around him stood in mournful stillness. No bird's song broke the air. No rustle of wind stirred the leaves, as if nature itself recognized the passing of something greater than a mere life. This was the departure of a legend. When the first drone camera swept above the misted treetops, its lens focused on the solemn image of Titan's silhouette, bathed in the golden light of morning. The world bore witness to a moment that would be etched into the collective memory of humanity. Across every screen, in homes and cities far from the quiet corners of Ironwood Ridge, the sight of that fallen guardian broke hearts and summoned tears from those who had never met him, but somehow felt as though they had known him all their lives. His story was no longer just a tale of war and betrayal. It had become a symbol of unshakable loyalty and the purest form of love, a bond that refused to be broken by death or time. Soldiers stood at attention across the nation, their salutes held longer than protocol demanded, their eyes misted with memories of their own fallen companions. Children placed small flags and worn dog tags at makeshift memorials that sprang up in towns and cities, their tiny hands trembling as they whispered quiet thank yous to a hero they'd only known through stories. And high above the grave, as the sun continued to rise and burn away the mist, the sky seemed to open in a brilliance that felt almost otherworldly, as if welcoming a faithful soldier home. They buried Titan that evening beneath the cedar tree, right beside Captain Vance, their names forever linked not just by stone and soil, but by the legend they had forged together through courage, sacrifice, and the love that stood defiant against the darkest shadows of betrayal. And as twilight descended and the first star appeared in the quiet sky, it seemed to shine just a little brighter, a silent signal that somewhere, beyond the veil of this world, two loyal souls had finally found their way home, together, at peace, forever.